Welcome back to Neville Month. This isn't really Neville Month, but we are today, and in the last few videos I've made, going over Neville's extremely good, you might even say superior, instructions for how to externally manifest desires in your life, following Neville's techniques, and really following, in my opinion, the best explanation of the techniques that Neville utilizes, that he ever gave, which is in the 5 lessons lectures, at the end of each of the 5 lectures, and then in the question and answer section of that series of lectures. Neville really provides very concise instructions for how to utilize the amazing advice he shares. Neville had such a long career. He was active from the late 30s until his death in 72. So that's almost like 35 years almost, basically, of lecturing. And, his philosophy and approach changed over that time somewhat. His explanation of how to, implement the law in your life from a technique standpoint didn't change all that much. But I think because he just was a very, explorative guy and liked to explain things in different ways, how he explained it varied somewhat, particularly later in his life, as he got more into the promise. And I just don't think he was ever as brilliantly concise as in these lectures, at least in terms of the stuff that's published. And, it's been, I've read most of Neville's lectures over the years, but it's really been years since I delved deeply into, all of them. I edited, a dozen books of Neville and his, various book writings and lectures. So I could be a little bit off about this in terms of, there might be another few lectures that are very specific and great in terms of giving technical details. I just think for almost all of us, especially for people who are relatively new to this information or just haven't had a lot of success applying Neville's specific techniques, 5 lessons is where to turn. And the specific instructions at the end of the book are, at the end of each lecture, I should say, in each of the 5 lessons, is really where to turn. To review what we've gone over, what we were going over from the first lecture, it's going to be the same thing that we're going to read from the second lecture today. It's the same thing. I mean, basically, Neville talks about creating a loop of a scene that happens after the fulfillment of your desire. I would say it's like a visceral loop. So it actually feels real while you're doing it. And you just loop this again and again. If it's like someone congratulating you, you just imagine, shaking someone's hand again and again in this drowsy, almost hypnotic state. You keep on doing that until it feels real. You just choose one short action. Another alternative that he gives, which is basically the same thing, he talks about it a little bit in the second lecture, is putting yourself in a place, like a different location than where you are, and feeling the wall in that place, or the chair you're sitting on in that desired place, putting your hand on that chair and feeling the wood on that chair. Something very small like that and specific until you actually feel like you're there. But it's basically the same thing as just a visceral feeling of being there, of actually having it, right there and now. So that small looping visceral action. Now, what we were talking about last video is that you do not necessarily have to have a physical action that you're doing. You don't necessarily have to be in that chair in a different location or be shaking that person's hand. You can simply recite a phrase, loop a short phrase over and over again in this hypnotic state until you get to a place where you actually feel it being true. It is real right now. It stops being pretend and becomes real. And you've heard anyone who's familiar with Neville has heard this stuff before. It's just, it helps so much to simplify and cut down all the other, the instructions that can confuse you, all the lectures that can be very confusing, especially in his later years, and cut it all down, if we want to be practical about using the techniques, to something like this, where it's just a few short things that he recommends you do. And when you cut them down to just these few couple options, like viscerally being in a different place, viscerally, shaking someone's hand or feeling a wedding ring on your finger or whatever after the fulfilled act has happened, something like that, or saying a phrase that viscerally you feel, signifies that you have what you want. When we just do that, it's much more simple to enact this technique regularly, to do it every day if we want, as opposed to trying to assume all this different stuff as we go about the day, which can get very overwhelming for a lot of people. So in the second lecture, at the end of the second lecture, Neville says, let me again clarify the technique. Know what you want. Then construct a single event, an event which implies fulfillment of your wish. Restrict the event to a single act. For instance, if I single out as an event shaking a man's hand, then that is the only thing I do. I do not shake it, then light a cigarette and do 1,000 other things. I simply imagine that I am actually shaking hands and keep the act going over and over and over again until the imaginary act has all the feeling of reality. That's the technique. You viscerally loop an act over and over again in a hypnotic, drowsy state, a state akin to sleep, a short, very short act. Over and over again, you loop it in that state until it feels real. That's the technique. Neville continues, the event must always imply fulfillment of the wish. Always construct an event which you believe you would naturally encounter following the fulfillment of your desire. You are the judge of what event you really want to realize. So it's up to you what event. But the point is, it must follow the fulfillment of that desire, of that wish, the act you do. And then he gives the other option. Neville says, there's another technique I gave you last night. If you cannot concentrate on an act, if you cannot snuggle into your chair and believe the chair is elsewhere, just as though elsewhere was here, then do this. Reduce the idea, condense it to a single simple phrase like, isn't it wonderful, or thank you, or it's done, or it's finished. And then you're going to loop that. Neville's going to talk about that in a second. So this is very important. We mentioned it last video. He's saying if you cannot get into the act of, shaking someone's hand, being in a different chair than the one you now are, but you're now in a chair in your desired location. If you can't do that, and so many people say they can't visualize in this way, guess what? Neville says that's okay. You can still use his advice. You can still use his manifesting advice. You just choose a very short phrase instead. So instead of shaking someone's hand, you say thank you, thank you, thank you over and over again in your mind in this drowsy hypnotic state until this thank you or this it's finished or isn't it wonderful or fuck yeah or oh my God or whatever phrase you want until it feels real. Neville says there should be no more than 3 words. Something that implies the desire is already realized. Isn't it wonderful or thank you certainly imply that. These are not all the phrases you could use. Make up out of your own vocabulary the phrase which best suits you. But make it very, very short and always use a phrase that implies fulfillment of the idea. So that's it. Those are the instructions. And it's, he says, just relax and enter into the feeling of actually being what you want to be. Very straightforward again. Incredibly straightforward. So, again, in my opinion, this is the meat of Neville's manifesting technique. And I think a lot of people will have more success if they just try following these simple techniques and, utilize it in one of these very simple ways he describes and, use it in the way that best suits them, whatever that short action may be or whatever that short phrase may be, that makes it so that they can most naturally feel that it's already happening, it's already real. You do that, and especially if you consistently do that, things are going to change in your outer world. And there's a very good chance if you consistently do this and you consistently feel this fulfillment over and over again, day after day, that what you want is going to manifest. All right, this is why Neville's so brilliant. We'll move on to the third lecture next video probably. But yeah, again, this is just primo Neville. If you have any questions or if you would like help from me, including very immersive coaching, I'm currently offering a month-long immersive coaching program with me, which is pretty freaking special if you're interested in that kind of thing. Just let me know. You can contact me on my website, radicalcounselor.com, or email me at info@radicalcounselor.com. Until next time.